Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for the first day of our third-party risk management bootcamp. We've been hosting bootcamps for 8 years now, and we're excited to have you join us this year around the campfire. We'll go on a virtual camping trip to discuss important third-party risk management topics. My name is Jessie Redmond, and I will be your host. On your screen, you should see multiple widgets that you can use. If you are unfamiliar with our webinars, all the widget boxes are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to maximize your screen space. At the bottom of your screen in the toolbar are icon buttons you can use to show and hide the widgets. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner of the widget. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can submit them through the Ask Question widget. Don't worry, we do capture all questions throughout each session. We will be answering some during the webcast, but those that we do not have a chance to answer live, we will address with you via email. In the Related Content widget, you'll see a link to a copy of today's slide deck, a link to our website, a link to our samples library, a link to our resources library, which has thousands of educational resources, and links to several specific resources that we feel will be helpful if you'd like to learn more about certain topics discussed today. We will also point these out to you throughout today's presentations. You'll also notice underneath the slide area and next to the Related Content widget is a graphic showing the third-party risk management lifecycle. This will be helpful to reference throughout the next 3 days as our sessions will be covering important steps through the entire lifecycle. This 3-day bootcamp is eligible to earn up to 6 CPE credits, 1 for each of the 6 live sessions, so 2 credits per day. If you wish to receive these credits, please remember to answer all the polling questions that will appear on your screen during each session's presentations and remain in attendance for the entire live sessions. You will also be sent a follow-up survey link 24 hours after the bootcamp has concluded on Friday, April 19th, that will need to be completed in order to receive the CPE credit. Before we get started, let's go through introductions of our speakers for this 3-day bootcamp. Day 1 of the bootcamp will kick off with Venminder's Hillary Dewhurst, who is Head of Third-Party Risk Education and Advocacy. She'll discuss criticality and risk ratings and implementing a risk-based vendor due diligence strategy. After that, Kelly Vick, Venminder's President, will discuss critical vendor contracts and an overview of fourth and nth-party vendors. Tomorrow, on Day 2 of the bootcamp, Lisa Mayhill, Venminder's Information Security Operations Director, will walk us through your vendor's cybersecurity posture and vendor business continuity and disaster recovery as part of your cybersecurity program. After that, Lisa will discuss vendor SOC reports, including reviewing findings and next steps. Then Hillary Dewhurst will join us again to discuss managing AI risk with third-party risk management. On Thursday, the last day of bootcamp, Raman Zachariah, Venminder's Chief Financial Officer, will join us to discuss your vendor's financial health in today's business climate. He will be followed by Christine Kitamura, Venminder's Senior Content Manager of Education, who will discuss regulatory requirements and expectations in third-party risk management. After our break, Hillary Dewhurst, Venminder's Head of Third-Party Risk Education and Advocacy, we'll discuss the top third-party risk management program metrics and reports, and then we'll cover vendor exit strategies and third-party risk management closure. Let's dive into the first hour with Hillary Dewhurst covering the basics of what you need to know when it comes to the difference between criticality and risk ratings, as well as steps to implement a risk-based vendor due diligence strategy. And with all that being said, I'd like to hand it over to Hillary. Hillary, the floor is yours.
All right, well, welcome everyone. So in our first session today, we're really going to talk about some core risk concepts. We're going to talk about the difference between criticality and risk rating. We're going to talk about some of the types of risks that you would identify through your inherent risk assessments, how to figure out if an engagement is critical or not, and we're going to talk a little bit about how to use residual risk. We're also going to talk about how you apply inherent risk and residual risk in your programs, and then we'll wrap up with some key takeaways. Now, one of the very first things we do right from the beginning when we're planning for that vendor engagement is we determine if it's going to go through our third-party risk management process. And if it is, the first things we do is identify the inherent risk of the engagement and determine if that product or service is going to be critical to our operation. So just to get you familiar with a few terms, I think you all know what risk is, but let's talk about inherent risk. Inherent risk is the risk that exists naturally and is associated with the product or service and therefore the vendor relationship. When we assess inherent risk, we're always thinking about raw risk or the risk that exists before we've thought about any controls to manage it. Criticality, on the other hand, is really about business impact. It's what we measure to think about if that vendor would fail or go out of business suddenly, how would that impact our operations or our customers? And every vendor should be rated as critical or non-critical. Residual risk is an estimation of the risk that remains after we've thought about the controls we're going to put in place to manage those inherent risks. Now, I want to draw a very clear distinction between risk ratings and criticality. So let's start with critical. Critical is not a risk rating. So I'm going to repeat that. It is not a risk rating. It is a label or a designation that we use to identify a small subset of vendors that are essential for your operations or that can impact your customers. And again, all vendors should be either critical or non-critical. On the other hand, your inherent risk ratings reflect the risks that are present in that product or service and are aggregates because they're measuring the different types of risks that are present. And they, as a best practice, fall on a scale or different levels. So best practices use high, moderate, and low risk. All right, let's talk about inherent risk for a minute. Inherent risk is an essential concept to understand because it is one of the foundational principles that drives so much of what we do in third-party risk management. Now, we assess risk based on the risk that's naturally present in the products and services provided to us by those vendors. And it's also important to remember that every product and service has at least some risk. Now, when we think about inherent risk, we're thinking about the risks that are there before we think about any controls or management techniques we might use to mitigate those risks. So inherent risk is always the raw risk. And we identify it through a formal and standardized inherent risk assessment. Now, that inherent risk assessment is always an internal document, and it should be completed by the vendor owner. Why? Because they typically know the most about the product or service they're trying to get from that vendor. We never ask the vendor to assess the inherent risk. All right, you might be wondering about some of the types of risk that we would be looking for in those inherent risk assessments. So let's go through a few of these. This is not a comprehensive list, but the big one is operational risk. This can be something that's happening internally because of people, processes, or systems. They fail or they're not effective, or externally because there's some sort of business interrupting event like a natural disaster or cyber attack. Business continuity risk is a subset of operational risk, and that's the risk that the vendor will not be able to continue to operate or get back up and running during or after one of those business interrupting events. Of course, we have reputation risk, the risk that the vendor does something, either breaks the law or treats your customers poorly or has a bad reputation that ultimately impacts your reputation and brand. We have compliance risk, and this means that the vendor failed to comply with laws and regulations and ultimately harms your organization. Geopolitical risk, which is doing business in other countries. They may have different laws or there's political unrest, human rights violations, etc. Information security risk, this is a big one. This can be either cyber or physical, and this is all of that cyber attacks, information protection security risk, all of the things that come with all of the data that we use, access, transmit, process, and store every day. We have transaction risk, which is when vendors process any kind of transaction on our behalf, and if they fail to do so correctly, it can affect our organization or our customers. We have financial risk, and this can mean that the vendor has poor financial health, which ultimately means that they may not be able to meet their contractual obligations or even to continue to provide that product or service. And then there's strategic risk, which means that the vendor's decisions and actions don't necessarily align with your organization's strategic objectives. So now that you have a better understanding of some of the types of risks, let's look at how they might be discovered through an inherent risk questionnaire. Again, that inherent risk questionnaire is an internal document, and it's going to ask a series of questions. Not that many, actually, usually around 20, and they're going to focus on the actual types of risks that might be present. So let's look at some examples. For business continuity, for example, we might ask the question, would a disruption in the service cause material impact to our organization, our clients, or customers? For cybersecurity, we might ask, is this a technology-related service that's going to require integration with the network, or will the vendor have access to our network? For reputational, we might ask, does the product or service in any way impact our clients or customers, or will they directly interact with them? Your vendor owner would go through and answer this series of questions to determine where we have risk in each of those risk domains. Once that questionnaire is complete, you should generate a risk rating. The risk rating is going to provide a cumulative rating of the engagement. So where you might be low in, say, reputational risk, you might be high in cybersecurity or operational risk, giving you an overall high risk rating. But again, remember the risks that are identified are primarily concerned with the product or service, and in a lot of ways can be agnostic to the vendor relationship. Best practices, we use a scale of low, moderate, and high, and whatever you do for your risk rating methodology, how your organization figures it out and creates the formulas, it should be standardized and documented. Again, please do not use critical as a risk rating. And remember that we have to periodically reassess the inherent risk. All right, so now that you have a risk rating, what do you do with it? Well, keep in mind that third-party risk management is a risk-based process. That means that risk rating is going to help you determine literally everything you need to do with that particular vendor relationship moving forward. First of all, risk ratings help you identify and prioritize which relationships need the most attention. And they're going to help you determine the requirements and routines for managing that relationship. So for example, higher risk relationships need more frequent and intensive risk reassessments, due diligence, risk and performance management, etc. But those risk ratings also help us scope our due diligence. So remember all those risks we identified in the inherent risk assessment? Those are the same risk domains that we need to go out and validate controls for. But keep in mind that your auditors and regulators are going to expect you to have an inherent risk rating for all your vendors. But as a best practice, we really don't need to have just a risk rating for the vendors. We need to have a risk rating for every product and service they provide. So if you have a vendor that provides 4 products and services, they need to have 4 individual risk ratings for each of those products and services, which may have you asking the question, then how do we risk rate the vendor? As a best practice, always default that risk rating of the vendor to the highest risk rating of the products and services they provide. So if that vendor provides 4 products and services, 3 of them are moderate and 1 of them high, then they are a high-risk vendor. Now, while you think of that, let's take a poll question.
And this brings us to the first poll question of the bootcamp. You should see the poll question now in the slides area. If you have any issues, please feel free to send us a message using the Ask Question widget, and we will be happy to assist. Please remember, if you wish to receive the CPE credit for today's session, you must answer all poll questions and be in attendance for the entire live session. This first question is, My organization has documented criteria to determine vendor criticality. Yes, no, or not sure. Hillary, we have some time now to answer a question from the audience.
Okay.
Great. Who decides what types of risk you are looking for? And do we have to look for all the risk you mentioned?
Oh, that's a great question. Basically, as with all things third-party risk, it's up to your organization to kind of set the tone and figure out what you're going to be looking for. However, there are some baseline risks that everybody should be looking at. So those would be your operational risk, your cybersecurity risk, any compliance risk, financial risks, and again, your reputation and brand risk. Now, if you want to look for other risks or you feel like there might be those risks existing, like concentration risk or geopolitical risk, certainly it's up to your organization to determine what you're looking at. But I would go with those 5 sort of baseline risks, their best practices, and those are the things that the regulators would expect us to identify in an inherent risk assessment. I hope that helps.
Thanks everyone for answering that poll question. Here are those results. By the way, you may have noticed reactions such as a thumbs up or heart coming across the screen. If you find this feature distracting, you can turn it off by clicking the 4 arrows in the top right-hand corner of the slides widget, which will expand the slides to full length and no longer show the reactions. Before we move on, please be aware that in the related content widget, you will find our Separating Vendor Criticality from Risk Ratings infographic available for download. This is a handy resource to grab as it dives into criticality versus risk ratings. Back to you, Hillary.
All right, now it's time to talk about criticality. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it's important for us to understand and be able to identify which of the vendors in our inventory are actually most important to our operations or can impact our customers. So to identify those vendors, we can ask 3 simple questions. The first one is, would a sudden loss of this vendor cause a disruption to our organization? And would that disruption impact our customers? Or if the time for the vendor to recover operations was more than 24 hours, would there be a negative impact to our organization? If you answer yes to any of those questions, you're probably dealing with a critical vendor. Now, depending on your organization, there may be some additional factors you want to consider. One might be if there's significant cost, resources, or time that might be involved if you had to bring that activity in-house. So you've invested a lot of money getting this vendor up and running. They go out of business. Now you have to bring it inside. It's going to require a whole new budget request, extra resources. That may be a critical vendor. If your organization would be subject to extra regulatory scrutiny if the vendor did not provide its products and services, or if that vendor's failure would cause significant harm to your brand or reputation. Now, again, everyone always asks what significant means. That definition has to be determined by your organization. But when we say significant, it is major, like it would be in all the newspapers and social media, etc. Okay, so why is it so important that we identify our critical vendors? Well, there's a lot of reasons, but the primary one is because there's so many expectations around these particular vendors. First of all, they are essential to our operations and can impact our customers. And that means that they require the most extensive due diligence, risk and performance management, and monitoring. And we have to have documented evidence that we perform those practices. They require the highest level of contract consideration and review, and they constantly have to undergo periodic risk reassessment and due diligence, at least on an annual basis. More importantly, per regulatory expectations for many industries, they need to be identified for senior management and the board. And because they're operationally essential, they need to be considered in our organization's business continuity and resiliency planning. But more than anything else, Critical vendors are always in scope for your internal audits and regulatory exams. So if you have a regulatory examiner coming in, they are going to start with your critical vendors. All right, so I want to talk real briefly about this concept of residual risk. So we talked about inherent risk. We talked about our risk ratings. Now we're going to talk about vendor due diligence in the next session, but essentially it's that process of going in and validating the vendor's controls. Now those controls are those risk management practices or processes that are put in place to reduce the likelihood, the impact, the occurrence, or severity of a risk, right? So once we've gone in and validated those controls, we would see that, yes, that impact has been lessened somehow. So now we're looking at what we call residual risk. So let's look at how this actually works. All right, let's look at an example. So in this example, we have a vendor that would have very high inherent risk. And that would be because there is high operational risk. We need them to be open 24/7. They also have very high compliance risk because they need state-specific licensing. They're also processing payments, so we know there's very high transaction risk. And with those payments, they're accessing, processing, and storing all kinds of PII, so we know there's very high cybersecurity risk. So right now, as you see, we're measuring all of the risks. We don't have any controls in place. We haven't even thought about that. We know their inherent risk rating is very high at this point. So we've gone in and done our due diligence. We've collected all the information and we've reviewed their controls. And what we've seen is that, yes, the vendor has a tested business continuity plan, so that kind of addresses some of our operational risks. They have all their current licenses, so that reduces the compliance risk. They are PCI certified, so that's reducing some of the transaction risk. And they have a satisfactory SOC 2 Type 2 report, which reduces a lot of the cybersecurity risk. So we see now that the controls have sort of balanced out some of that inherent risk, and their residual risk is more of a moderate rating, okay? So we can see how those controls have sort of counterbalanced that inherent risk. We still have some leftover risk, but it's not as significant as it initially was. Now you may be wondering, based on those previous slides, if in fact your new risk rating should be moderate. The controls seem to have reduced that likelihood, occurrence, severity, or impact of the risk. So should your new risk rating be moderate? The answer is absolutely no. We only ever use a residual risk rating to determine if the remaining risk is acceptable, to help us understand if we need to move forward with that contract or if other controls or different controls are necessary before we're confident enough that we want to move forward, or maybe we don't want to move forward at all. Now, sometimes there are often cases where even after the application of controls, we still can't get that risk down enough. So something that's inherently high, even after controls, is still has a residual risk of high. We may decide not to move forward or accept that risk. But in those cases, we pay extra attention to that particular relationship. Just keep in mind that residual risk should never be used in place of your inherent risk to set any management routines or determine your due diligence or figure out how much risk and performance management you need. That should always and forever be based on your inherent risk. All right, let's wrap up this section with some key takeaways. So when it comes to criticality, please remember it's not a risk rating. It's a label that's going to help you identify that subset of vendors that you rely on operationally or that can impact your customers. Critical vendors always require that really intensive due diligence. They have to have meticulous and well-written contracts, and they require the most frequent and detailed risk and performance monitoring in management. And your regulators and auditors are always going to include them in their scope for audits and exams. Every vendor engagement should be rated as critical or non-critical. When it comes to your risk ratings, remember, they identify the types and amounts of risk present in that product or service and therefore the vendor relationship. They're going to help you establish the frequency and intensity of management for the lifetime of the relationship and help you identify the specific risk activities that you need to do and scope your due diligence. Remember, it should always be established at the product or service level, and the highest risk rating should default to the vendor's risk rating. Now with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jessie.
Great. Thanks so much, Hillary, for that informative session. We'll now move on to our next session, which is steps to implement a risk-based vendor due diligence strategy. Hillary will discuss risk-based vendor due diligence and how it will save you time and resources and be more effective in managing vendor risk. Again, you can refer to the full life cycle that is below the slides area on your screen to understand where this fits into the process. Hillary, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks, Jessie. So now we're going to talk about vendor due diligence. We're going to talk about what it is, what risk-based vendor due diligence really means. We're going to talk about all those documents you should be collecting and what to do when you can't get those documents, because that happens. And then we'll wrap up with some key takeaways. So let's jump right in. So what is risk-based vendor due diligence? Well, first of all, due diligence is the process of verifying that you're doing business with a legitimate business entity that has a good reputation before you get into business with them, and you're verifying that the vendor's risk management practices and controls are sufficient to manage the risks associated with the products and services they're offering to you. So here are some key things to understand, or as we say, fundamental concepts of vendor due diligence. First of all, it needs to be risk-based. That means the higher the risk, the more thorough the due diligence must be. It's also a documented and evidence-based practice. That means we keep excellent records, we retain all the documents, we have written reports. And it also requires the participation of qualified subject matter experts. That means that somebody with professional credentials and certifications goes in per risk domain, they validate the controls, they identify any gaps, and they review and confirm any required issue remediation that was discovered along the way. It's also important to understand that vendor due diligence is not a one and done exercise, but that it's required on a regular basis throughout the relationship. That's because it's a point in time review, and we need to consistently look and reevaluate those controls. Now, of course, it's a best practice because it's really looking before you leap, as they say. But if you're in a regulated industry, it is a regulatory requirement. So for many organizations, it's something we have to do to meet regulatory compliance. So if you're interested in those regulatory expectations, we've listed a few here. By no means is this a complete inventory of all the regulatory expectations, but just to highlight a few, we have the interagency guidance on third-party relationships, such as for the financial industry, HIPAA, which of course is for healthcare and medical. We have FINRA, again, that's a financial regulation. We have certification schemes like NIST, ISO, ITIL, and HITRUST. We have international, like the UK Serious Fraud Office Bribery Act, and privacy laws like GDPR, CCPA, and state privacy laws. So as you can see, due diligence is a pretty broad requirement against many regulatory expectations. All right, let's talk about due diligence and what it actually is, because many people have different ideas. But the fact is that due diligence is really a multi-part process that begins with the scoping of due diligence based on the risks that we identified in that inherent risk questionnaire. So we need to know the types of risks, compliance, cyber risk, operational, etc. And we also need to know how severe those risks were. We also need to identify if that vendor is going to be critical to our operations or if they can impact our customers. Based on that information, we'd start collecting vendor information and documentation. So we'd want to get all of their basic information, like who they are, their corporate address, information about their principals, their business license, etc. And we'd want them to complete a vendor questionnaire covering their relevant risk domains. So if they have cyber risk, we'd ask them to complete the part of the questionnaire that talks about their cyber risk controls. We'd also ask them for due diligence documentation that serves as evidence of those risk controls. We might also conduct a site visit or collect other information as necessary. Once we have that information and that documentation, we turn it over to the subject matter expert for review. Now, that subject matter expert will review the information. Usually, subject matter experts work by risk domain, so subject matter expert for cybersecurity or compliance or business continuity, etc. And they're looking for issues or gaps in the controls. They're validating that evidence to make sure those controls are sufficient. When they're finished, they should complete a review and a documented report with their qualified opinion as to the sufficiency of those controls. Now, once we've completed this, we will be able to calculate our residual risk. Is the remaining risk acceptable? Are there any issues that need to be remediated? Do we need more or different controls before we can move forward? If there are issues that need to be remediated, we need to think about, is this something that we need to do before we can move forward with the contract? If yes, then we'll go into an issue remediation. Or if we can write them into the contract, then we'll need to put those in the contract and have them all reviewed. And if we do put them in the contract, they will always need to be time-bound. So that is really the look of due diligence sort of end to end. Now, I want to point out that because due diligence is a risk-based activity, that the documents we collect, the information that we require, the level of expertise required to review all of that is going to change depending on the risks that are present and whether or not that vendor is going to be critical to our operations. So just to point this out, if you look at the low, we're just going to collect some baseline information about who that vendor is, name, address, etc. And we might require some baseline documentation. We may not even need an SME to review the information for an office supplies vendor, for example. But in contrast, if you look at the critical vendor, we're going to need all of the information, a very comprehensive vendor risk questionnaire. We're going to need extensive documentation. We're going to need, obviously, very qualified SMEs, but we may even be reviewing our internal controls in that instance and doing site visits and even interviewing the principals of that organization. This is just to illustrate that in a risk-based due diligence process, you really do need to adjust your efforts and what you're doing based on the risk and criticality. All right, over the next few slides, we're going to show you some information, and while we're going to go through it quickly, and we don't expect you to memorize it all, it's really to illustrate the principle that depending on the risk of the product and service, we need to continually make sure that the information that we're collecting and reviewing is on par with the risk of the product and service. So remember, all products and services have at least some risk. So no matter what it is, even in a low-risk situation, we'd want to collect and verify at least some information to make sure that, one, they're a legitimate business and that they have a good reputation. So depending on the product or service, we may need a non-disclosure agreement or confidentiality agreement, but we always need their basic information. We want to make sure they're a legitimate entity by reviewing their state of incorporation, that they have a business license, that they're in good standing. Maybe we review online reviews or check the Better Business Bureau, look at complaints, customer complaints, understand their basic credit profile, get a tax ID so that we can pay them. Now, as the risk increases, maybe we're at a moderate risk level. We start looking at things like financials, really collecting their insurance certificates, looking at appropriate compliance policies, and we start looking at how they manage their third parties. We might start investigating their SOC reports and investigating their audits, really diving into their information security policies, record retention, background checks, and hiring practices. Again, as that risk is increasing, we're collecting more information and we're being really specific to the risks that are present. So with high risk vendors, we're going to get all that baseline information, everything we were collecting for a moderate, and we're going to add on to that because now we're getting more comprehensive policies and procedures. We're really going to be looking into their senior management and owners. We're going to be really diving into things like logical access management, data classification, incident management, and we're going to be really tapping into their business continuity and disaster recovery plans, their protocols, and their test results of those. We might be investigating their penetration, vulnerability testing, their network diagram, how their data flows. We might look at their network outages and any SLA violations and go on site potentially. Now, while you're thinking about that, it is time for a poll. Jessie?
Our second poll question of the day is, we have a standardized list of due diligence documentation to be collected by risk level and risk domain. Yes, for some risk domains, but not all. No, or not sure. Hillary, I have another question here that we can answer from the audience.
Okay.
And this question is, do you have to have due diligence on all vendors or only high risk and critical ones?
Well, you have to do some level of due diligence on all vendors. For low risk and moderate, you may be looking at those details that can verify that they're a legitimate business and they have a good reputation. But what due diligence is about is identifying that vendors have proper risk practices and controls to remediate the risks you've identified. So regardless of the risk rating, if you go in and you identify that a vendor has cybersecurity risk, then you need to do some level of due diligence on them, even if they're a moderate vendor. But you definitely need to have very robust due diligence on all of your critical and high-risk vendors. I hope that answers the question.
Great. Thanks so much, Hillary. Please get those responses in momentarily as we will be closing the poll shortly. If you have any questions along the way, please remember to put them in the Ask Question widget and we will be happy to assist. Thank you. Okay, here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer the poll. Before continuing, I would like to direct your attention to our 7 steps of risk-based vendor due diligence infographic and matrix in the related content widget. Be sure to check out these resources for examples of risk-based vendor due diligence. Okay, Hillary, back to you.
All right, before the poll question, we showed you a series of slides to illustrate how the level of due diligence and information required increase along with that risk rating is really extensive for critical vendors. So now I want to show you a few examples of specific controls we would be looking at, as well as due diligence items to collect based on specific types of risk. And we'll start with business impact risk and critical vendors. So some of the control areas we'd look at would be internal communications, specific SLAs, business continuity, disaster recovery, human resources, which is all that background checking, training, and performance monitoring, as well as their compliance structure, which includes audit, how they manage risk, and how they manage their vendors. Some of the due diligence items we would collect would include their business continuity and disaster recovery, both the planning and the testing, any certifications or proof of regulatory compliance, all their associated policies and procedures, their SOC 2 Type 2 report, and their list of critical vendors, and we would want to see proof of vendor risk management assessments, risk monitoring, etc. Now, if there's a cybersecurity or data risk, they're hosting or storing sensitive information, of course, we need to look at their information security controls, their governance, cloud, physical system and network security, their access and asset management, as well as their human resources, privacy, compliance, vendor risk management, and their financial health. So we would be asking for all of those certifications and proof of regulatory compliance, all their associated policies and procedures, their SOC 2 Type 2 report, their vulnerability and penetration testing, their list of critical vendors, and any of those that might access data. That would include any of their fourth-party vendors that might access data as well. We want all of that proof of vendor risk management, those assessments, risk monitoring, etc., their privacy policy and financials. And when the vendor is directly interacting with our customers or clients, there's really big reputational and compliance risk. So we want to look at their reputation very carefully. And we want to pay specific attention to their human resources information, including background checks and how their people are trained, specifically in compliance, privacy, information security, and how their performance is monitored. We want a strong emphasis on their privacy overall, all their compliance, and how they're managing their vendors. And we'd be looking at all their certifications and proof of regulatory compliance and training, all their policies and procedures, and their internal privacy policy. Now, when a vendor has unescorted access to your facilities, there's some risk there. So we want to make sure that we are looking at their internal communication and approvals, controls. We have established SLAs in our contract with active monitoring. We do want to pay a lot of attention to those human resources controls, including those background checks, all of the training and the performance monitoring, as well as all of their privacy and compliance information. So that means we're collecting that list of employees who will be granted access, and we want evidence of their background checks and screening. We want evidence of privacy and compliance training and all their associated policies and procedures. All right, maybe we have a lot of financial risk because we're spending a lot of money with this vendor. We've invested a lot to bring them on board, so we want to make sure that we have really great SLAs and active monitoring. We have great communication and approvals, but we're really going to be diving into their financial health. So we want all of those certifications and proof of regulatory compliance, all their policies and procedures, their SOC 2 Type 2 report, and we really want to dive into their financials. So what happens if you ask your vendor for some information, your documentation, and either can't or won't provide it to you? Because this does happen. So the very first thing I always recommend is to put the onus back on your vendor to suggest an alternative way of verifying the control. Like, you didn't give it to me, how do you suggest we verify this control? It'll be up to your organization to determine if you can accept an alternative. But some of those alternatives might be reviewing the document or the information online versus actually receiving it. That might be one alternative. You could look at redacted documents potentially, or even have your SME interview someone at their organization regarding the controls. If it is an existing vendor, do check your contract to see if you have a right to audit clause, because refusing to give you that information could be in violation of that contract right to audit clause, which means they would be in breach of contract. No matter what, always document any attempts to collect information, no matter what the outcome is. If you decide to terminate the contract, if you decide to go to another vendor, or even if your organization decides to accept the risk and move on. That way, you will have the documentation for an auditor or an examiner to review in case it comes up. All right, I think it is time for another poll. Jesse?
poll question is, before executing a vendor contract, our organization requires the completion of due diligence and remediation of any issues. Yes, yes, but it isn't consistently enforced, no, or you are not sure. Hillary, let's go ahead and answer another question from the audience.
Okay, let's do it.
Do the regulators have a standard list of documents they expect you to collect?
They do not, and I'll tell you why. So when you read regulatory guidance, it's important to understand that it is a framework and outlines its expectations. But they don't go into such great detail that if you couldn't get those specific documents, for example, that you would be in trouble. They like to say that they're giving you flexibility, and that's true. And you definitely want to pay attention to the one requirement about documentation, and that is that you have good documents that serve as evidence of those controls. Those are what you should be able to share with an auditor or a regulatory examiner if they ask. So no list of documents. The requirement is that you have good documented evidence. I hope that clears that up.
Thanks so much, Hillary. Just a reminder, if you wish to receive the CPE credit for today's session, you must answer all poll questions that appear on your screen and be in attendance for the entire live session. Please get those responses in quickly. We will be closing this poll momentarily. Thank you. And here are those results. Thank you, everyone, for answering this question. As a reminder, back in the related content widget, you'll find our due diligence checklist for low, moderate, and high-risk vendors. Hillary, we're ready to continue with the presentation.
Okay, as we said before, due diligence, periodic risk reassessments are never one and done, and it is based on the risk and criticality. All critical and high risk have to be done at least once a year. Moderate can be every 12 to 18 months, depending on the product or service. And low, you're not really going to be doing too much due diligence, but it should be every 3 years or before contract renewal. Keep in mind, other situations may prompt off-cycle reviews, such as poor performance, declining financials, mergers, acquisitions. And also keep in mind that some due diligence documents do expire. Stock documents are one, insurance certificates are another. So you are going to need to track those expiration dates and make sure you're getting current documentation, even if it's off cycle. Okay, there's a few things that we can recommend to make the due diligence process easier and more effective. The first one is to work with the subject matter experts to establish standardized vendor risk questionnaires and lists of due diligence documentation by risk domain. That can help you be more organized in your vendor requests and make sure you ask for everything you need up front. Always stick to your processes and document those attempts to collect vendor information, whether you get it or not. Keep in mind that some large organizations are just not going to participate in due diligence. Do your best and document it. Keep in mind that for your existing vendors, if you have a right to audit clause in the contract, that entitles you to due diligence information. Make sure that you have qualified SMEs reviewing and validating vendor controls. Identify a risk-based schedule for periodic due diligence and identify situations or events that are going to merit off-cycle due diligence. Keep in mind that you should always have a recent set of risk assessment and due diligence before you renew any contract. And always track and manage important due diligence documentation expiration dates and act accordingly. All right, so let's wrap up this session with some key takeaways. So first of all, when we take a risk-based approach to due diligence, it's going to do two things. It's going to help us focus on the biggest risk, and it's going to help us use our resources wisely. Keep in mind that critical and high-risk vendors always require the most comprehensive due diligence, so it's going to require more, and yep, it's going to take a little bit longer. When we collaborate with our SMEs to get these comprehensive vendor questionnaires and identify those standard due diligence document lists, it's going to save everyone time in the long run. It's going to make it easier for us and for the vendors. We always want to make sure to include that right to audit clause in our contracts because it's going to entitle us to get that due diligence information down the line. And remember that after we conclude due diligence and we figure out that residual risk, that we only ever use that score to determine if that leftover risk is within our risk appetite or if we need to do more, investigate different or additional controls before we can move forward. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jessie.
Great. Thanks so much, Hillary, for another informative session. Before we move on to our next session, where Kelly Vick will discuss critical vendor contracts, we're going to take a quick 10-minute break. Please meet us back right here in 10 minutes. You do not need to close out and log back in. Just simply leave everything as is. Once you return before the top of the hour, we do recommend refreshing your connection to ensure your connection is ready to go for the next session. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. We'll now move on to our next session, how to treat critical vendor contracts differently. Again, you can refer to the full life cycle that is below the slides area on your screen to understand where vendor contracts fit into this process. We'll be hearing from Kelly Vick, VinMinder's president. Kelly, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jesse. And so as Jesse mentioned, in this session, we're going to talk about how we treat critical vendor contracts differently. And in doing that, we're going to first take a quick review of vendor contract management as a process, and then we will talk about critical vendors and the contract considerations that should be considered specifically for them, and then end with a few key takeaways from this session. Let's start by talking about what vendor contract management is. It is the oversight of written agreements with the vendors or suppliers that you have chosen. And that's all vendors or suppliers, not just your critical ones at this point. Contract management includes negotiating the terms of these contracts to ensure that all the terms and provisions and controls are important to you, and maybe those that you discovered during your due diligence step are actually addressed in the contract. It also includes a process for ensuring that the contract is reviewed, approved, and executed properly. And as we have talked about, your third-party risk management program should specify that process that should occur with your vendors, and especially with your critical vendors. Also, contract management includes ensuring that all of your vendor contracts, regardless of the contract value, are stored in some central repository with proper controls. And this is so important because we've seen so many times that customers, when they're onboarding onto our platform, that just don't know where to find all of their contracts. It is a common challenge, so finding a central repository is definitely a solid process in contract management. And lastly, contract management also includes ongoing maintenance of that contract and the vendor relationship. It's important over the term of the contract that you monitor compliance with the terms and that you ensure critical dates and other critical requirements, such as SLAs, are managed. The bottom line to point out here is that contract management is not a one-and-done process. It can be one of the most difficult and time-consuming parts of all of third-party risk management, particularly if you are in an organization that has a decentralized approach to contract management. But important process is to ensure that it is an ongoing part of your process. On this slide, you will see a list of major elements that should be included in all of your vendor contracts. Each of these elements should be clearly outlined in such a way that they are abiding by the regulatory requirements of the industry that you happen to be in, or the industry that the vendor is in, or a combination of both. To speak to regulatory requirements for financial institutions specifically, there's two places to turn to see exactly what is expected in the contracts and as far as contract language goes. One is the FFIEC IT Examination Handbook, and the other is the most recent interagency guidelines that were published in mid-2023. But even if you're not a financial institution, I would offer that both of these sources is a solid list of key legal elements for any contract, and you'll find all of these outlined and discussed in those. While all of these elements are important, I will call out that those surrounding termination and renewal provisions, as well as notification and remedy provisions, are likely those that are the least understood, or maybe the least clarified, the least defined, that cause the most ambiguity, but become the most critical when there may be troubles with the vendor and looking for ways to get out of the contract or improve the situation. But regardless of the industry that you are in and the regulations that you are required to follow, or again, that your vendor is required to follow, it does take people who understand these regulations and other guidance, and who understand the meaning of them and the impact of changes to them and to your organization. So this is where, especially as it relates to critical vendors, where you will need to bring in legal help, whether that's inside or outside counsel, to make sure that the details are truly understood to best support your position in that contract. Over the next few slides, we're going to address some special considerations as it relates to, again, specifically your critical vendors. But in general, let's just cover a few points. Because these vendors are critical to the ongoing success of your business, it is prudent, wise, best practice that you find ways to reduce or mitigate those risks that are posed with this business arrangement and address those in the contract. I'm talking about things like ensuring that there are breach clauses, cure clauses for things like software or product defects, termination rights that are important to you, possibly even some refund language about some items maybe missing SLAs, which is another one to be sure that you cover in these contracts is strong SLAs and what happens if they aren't met. And I mentioned this on the last slide, but also with your critical vendors, it again is the best practice to ensure that these contracts are overseen by your legal professionals, whether they're in-house or external or whatever it is you're using. There's many ways to structure a contract document, so you want to make sure it's structured to suit the business relationship. For example, if you anticipate multiple services or products from this vendor, then you would want an overarching MSA that has accompanying SOWs or order forms in place for each of those services and products. By doing it this way, this helps reduce the amount of legalese that will need to be negotiated each time you want to add on a service, because all that was done up front with the MSA. And again, just take the extra care and attention since these are your critical vendors.
And here's our next poll question. How do you manage and promote contract templates with your vendors? We have one template that we lead with regardless of vendor criticality or risk. We have various templates that we lead with, and each account for vendor criticality and risk. We don't have any contract templates that we lead with. We default to the vendor or supplier contract, other or not sure. Kelly, while we wait for the results to tabulate on this one, we can answer another question from the audience. And this question is, can you provide some specific things that should be done during an ongoing review of a contract?
Sure. So when you are conducting your ongoing review, periodic review, ongoing monitoring, whatever word you might use for your third-party vendor, and in that time you're probably, again, conducting a risk assessment, updating profile information, maybe collecting due diligence documents, things like that. At that same time is when you should pull that contract out, dust it off, and just review the language in the contract to make sure that you aren't missing any very important terminology, maybe some provisions. Maybe there's been some regulatory changes since that contract was put in place, possibly some privacy laws changes, or just anything like that that might have taken place since you first put that contract in place. And so maybe it's time to, even if you can't do anything about it right then, make a note of what changes do need to be made with this contract at the time of renewing or extending the term. It's also a great time to remind yourself of those expiration dates and the notification periods around those expiration dates, and to ensure that you have it properly set up in whatever system you're using, hopefully some type of online contracting solution that will remind you of those dates and when they come due, so that you don't miss them. Because especially if you have found things that you need to take place to shore up that contract, then you certainly want to take advantage of a contract extension, a contract renewal with updated documents. You should also at this time take a review of your performance. You know, how is this vendor doing? Are they meeting the service level agreements if they happen to be in place? Are you concerned about any fourth parties that they might be using? So that's a variety of things that you should be doing during that time when you're reviewing your vendor, reviewing your contract at the same time.
Okay, everyone, here are those results. Thank you for submitting your responses. I'd like to share that in the related content widget, you will find our Mitigating Vendor Risk Through Effective Contract Management Practices infographic. Review this resource to learn more about how effective contract management can have potential cost savings and brief saver relationships. Back to you, Kelly.
When you are looking to bring on a new vendor, especially again, a critical vendor is what we're talking about, those due diligence reviews should be completed in advance of finalizing that contract execution. Why is that important? Well, during your due diligence reviews, you probably uncover some issues that were identified either about that vendor, or you uncovered those risky situations presented to your organization with this particular vendor that you want to make sure that you address in the contract. You want to make sure that these types of things are memorialized in the contract and that there is some language in there speaking to remediation of these types of ongoing due diligence and ongoing monitoring with these critical vendors. An execution of a contract before due diligence is complete can certainly create some practical and legal issues. Practical issues is that it just may not be practical for it to happen, and you may just need to go ahead and get that contract signed before you have time to do all of that prudent due diligence. And there will be times that will need to be done. And when that is happening, you should certainly include some type of contract clause that allows post-contract issues and how they're going to be remediated, especially as it relates to discoveries that are found when that formal due diligence is done. And again, this is all in practical business. You know, we all have to do things to make sure whatever is necessary to run our business, and we know this happens. But just be sure to cover yourself in some kind of out clause or remediation that is documented in the contract. Let's talk for a moment about monitoring. Again, your critical vendors and the contracts as part of the monitoring process should also be reviewed during that annual review or whatever periodic review you conduct on that vendor. Once you sign that contract, as I mentioned previously, it should not be a one and done process. Those critical vendors must be monitored for those critical vendor contracts must be monitored for expiration dates, so you make sure that nothing is missed that is important to you, such as a notification date for termination, for example, or price increase, for example. And then you need to be reviewing these critical vendor contracts on a regular, ongoing basis to ensure that if there's been some changes in laws or regulations, that you know where you might have some gaps in this contract to ensure compliance by that vendor with those updated laws and regulations. A few things to keep in mind as it relates to contract review, storage, and retrieval of those critical vendor contracts is that your vendor owners, those that are responsible for that vendor relationship, should really be strongly encouraged to read and understand their critical vendor contracts. If the vendor owners are the ones that should know the most about those vendors, and knowing the most about those vendors and the relationship that you have with those vendors as far as what they're offering, the service, etc., should also include knowing the contract and the restrictions around the contracts. Those vendor owners should also, again, be reviewing those contracts as part of their ongoing monitoring and ongoing performance reviews of the vendor. I think I've mentioned that a couple of times now. And they need to ensure, whether it's a vendor owner or a centralized responsible party, whatever it is, that the contract with these vendors are recorded and monitored and maintained, preferably in some centralized system. There may be times when you have a critical vendor that is based in a foreign location, foreign to whatever your primary location is. For sake of argument, I'll use non-U.S. companies. So these foreign courts, non-U.S. courts, and laws very likely differ from U.S. courts in this situation, using them as an example again. So when you are working with a vendor that is not in the U.S., you certainly need to understand how their laws may enforce different provisions within the contract. How to make, one of the biggest things in these contracts is to make sure that you have the protection of the data privacy, of customer information, and just that you have a clear understanding of the government entities that are involved in the contract process. It's very advisable to seek expert legal advice in these contracts. Again, there's so many legal ramifications that can occur with the differences between the regulations and the laws of the two countries. So having an expert be a part of that contract for these critical vendors is advisable. And then understand that these contracts and agreements are very likely subject to interpretation of foreign courts, relying on local laws. So there can definitely, if it ever came to some disputes about the contract, it could result in some lengthy negotiation, court costs, etc. I mentioned a few slides back that there may be instances or circumstances where you either are not able to do any type of due diligence ahead of the contract, or in this case, not be able to do any contract negotiation. If you want to do business with that vendor and that vendor says, you take my contract as is and we're not willing to negotiate on anything, you know, there's times when it may be necessary for you to do that. In those instances, you certainly want to document the steps and the conversations that you had around how, you know, how you could possibly negotiate some changes, who you worked with, what their roles were in that decision making, any additional data or documentation that you reviewed prior to signing that contract without being allowed to negotiate any of the terms, and really any other relevant documents or details that will support the approval of this process, this contract with this critical vendor that didn't follow your agreed upon process. A few slides back had a page of provisions that needed to be included in your contracts, and these are some additional provisions specifically for critical and high-risk vendors. I won't talk about each one of these, but I do want to call them out. You certainly want to have some information security guidelines in there, customer complaint management, understand what regulatory body is supervising this contract. You might want with these vendors to have a data protection agreement, definitely talk about data retention and what happens to the data post-contract. Fourth parties is very important with your critical vendors, so you may require disclosure of that. Certainly would want some insurance provisions detailed, possibly the provision to audit these critical vendors, and then certainly notification requirements calling out specifically around maintenance, so you understand when the service is not going to be available and what the notification period is around that, and any significant changes with this vendor, specifically as it relates to subcontractors, but there could be other reasons.
Our next poll question is, when you perform due diligence on your critical vendors, do you also perform some level of review on your contract with these vendors? Our third-party risk management policy requires a review of the contract as part of the ongoing monitoring of our critical vendors. We don't have an official or documented process to follow as it relates to reviewing the contracts of our critical vendors. Once a contract with a critical vendor is signed, it's filed away and not reviewed again, or not sure. Kelly, here is another question from the audience. What do you recommend if we can't have all of our critical vendor contracts reviewed by a legal counsel?
Well, since you said critical vendors, you've already determined the level of risk that you have with that vendor. Your number of critical vendors should be a subset of all of your vendors. What we typically see is somewhere between 10 to 15% of the vendor inventory are truly critical vendors. So one way to limit it even further is to identify a certain dollar threshold where you are comfortable foregoing legal counsel review. You might also consider asking your legal counsel to pull together some approved language and sections where you are able to authorize changes without their assistance or review, leaving only certain provisions that would require their review, and especially if you're using outside counsel, would thus reduce the cost associated with it. As an example of how this can work, we have an internal contracting team here at Venminder and a paralegal team who do the initial review and have a library. We have a library literally of approved and accepted language. And we've become very self-sufficient, but there absolutely are times when we still rely on our legal counsel, and we do indeed rely on outside counsel. So we're very aware of the costs associated with that and have taken those kinds of steps to be able to self-assess these contracts.
And here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer this poll question. Before we move on, I'd like to direct your attention back to the related content widget, where you can find our What to Include in Your Critical Vendor Contracts ebook. As your critical vendor contracts are under great scrutiny and should include more provisions, this is a great resource to grab to help you with those requirements. Kelly, back to you.
So this brings us to our final slide for this part of the boot camp, and that is just to point out a few key takeaways from the things I've just been talking about. And one is to have a contract management process in place and use a reliable tool for contract storage and tracking of very important contract expiration dates and other critical information. Another one is to understand that vendor contract management doesn't end with the contract signing. Remember, I said it is not a one and done process, and it should be included in the ongoing monitoring that you are doing on that critical vendor. And critical vendor contracts should include additional provisions that we just quickly ran through, and certainly a review by legal professionals. And lastly, when contract negotiation and or due diligence prior to the contract execution is limited or not allowed, that you should, best practices tell you to document the process and how the decision was made to move forward with that vendor despite not having the ability to perform that step. And with that, Jesse, I will turn this portion back over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Kelly, for the informative session. We'll now move on to our next session, which is an overview of fourth and nth party vendors. Again, you can refer to the full life cycle that is below the slides area on your screen to better understand where this fits into the third-party risk management process. Kelly, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jesse. And yes, in this last session of today's boot camp, we are going to spend time talking about fourth-party vendors and just talking through what that means, what they are, how to identify and assess them, and particularly manage them, and then how to determine if your third party is managing the fourth-party vendor appropriately. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm sure most of you on this call today know that your third-party risk management extends beyond just your third parties. It also includes fourth-party risk management. So a fourth-party vendor is one with which your third-party vendor has a direct relationship, and you do not have a relationship, a contractual relationship with that fourth-party vendor at all. So just as you outsource your activities to your third parties, your third party may also utilize some vendors of their own where they are using them to assist them in the delivery of their products and services. And in doing so, that makes them your fourth party and very important to you. Let's talk just a moment about the importance of these fourth party vendors to your company. So most of you on this call are using products and services from vendors to supplement the products and services that you are offering to your customers. And just like your organization, your third parties have critical vendors that can disrupt their ability to provide those products and services to you. So negative impacts to your organization can be caused by failures of not only fourth parties, but think about this, they also are using vendors to help them deliver to the third party to you. So those are the fourth and fifth and sixth and so on, the nth parties as we have described them. So your organization must ensure that the products and services that you are obtaining from these vendors, and especially as it relates to your critical and high-risk vendors, are provided dependably and with the right quality and service levels from all of these nth level parties. Let's take a quick look at what your third-party vendor universe looks like. And here you will see you are in the middle and you have a handful or so of third parties who are providing some type of outsourced service for you. These third parties, again, can be critical vendors, high-risk vendors, low-risk vendors, all kinds. And it depends on your organization as how many of these that you have. But this is what your third-party vendors look like, and they have a direct relationship with you. But that universe, as you can see in this picture, expands drastically when you bring in those fourth and nth parties that are a part of the third party that you are working with. So this, as you can see, can become very broad and very unmanageable if had to be managed at each level or with each one of these vendors. So therefore, it is very important that you have a strong third-party management relationship with your third-party vendors to ensure that they have all of these nth parties under control and doing the things you expect them to do just as you expect your third party to do. So we're going to talk more about that on the following slides. So why should you worry about these fourth and nth party risks? Because again, you don't have a direct relationship with them, but there are often hidden risks that can harm your organization. So let's just talk about a few of these. First and most important one is those pesky cybersecurity attacks that just continue to surface every single day. Again, just because you don't have a contractual relationship with these fourth and nth parties, they are just as subject to these attacks as your third party is. So those hidden risks live there, as do regulatory compliance. These vendors, your fourth parties and so on, are generally bound by the same regulatory requirements that your third party and you are. Business continuity and resilience, especially again if it is a critical vendor, you want to be certain that if something were to go sour with the fourth party, that your third party that fourth party can resume quickly so that your third party and therefore you are not impacted. And you can continue on down talking about these same type of risks with data privacy, the financial impact. You want to make sure you have a strong fourth party so that they are continuing business concern. And then reputation and liability. The impact of these fourth parties could have a significant impact on your reputation, even though, again, you do not have a direct relationship with them. So there are many reasons to worry about these fourth parties. Are all of these fourth parties relevant to you? Probably not. So we need to talk about how to determine which of those fourth parties do or could significantly impact your third party's ability to provide those services to you. So let's kind of go through this little question scenario here. Is your third party critical, and do they have a material impact or host sensitive data? If you can answer yes to that, then let's move on to, does your third party rely on vendors to support services to you and or share your data with that organization or multiple organizations? And again, these are the fourth parties to you. If that's yes as well, then these are the fourth parties that must be disclosed to you and held accountable by the third party to ensure that they are performing as you expect that third party to perform. So those are the ones that are relevant to you. There are so many types of third parties and fourth party combinations, and again, many of the third parties have multiple fourth parties. So this is just a very simple example of two third parties and the potential types of fourth parties they would have. So one is a prepaid card program. This is something that many financial institutions will have, and this is a contract with your prepaid card provider, third party, again, directly with your organization, and they are dependent on a fourth party for providing data center services. Most likely that prepaid card program is not doing that themselves, so they are contracting with someone that is going to be providing those services and ensuring that the processes around those services are available 100% of the time, most likely, and so that is obviously very critical to your organization when you are offering those very important credit cards and debit cards to your customers. Another example is human resources and payroll services. We all have employees that are critical to your organization and critical that they are paid timely. And so a fourth party to many payroll or HR services would be network management and ensuring availability of the system to be up so that when payroll needs to process, it processes and your employees are paid timely. So these, again, are just two very simple examples of third parties that you would have a contractual relationship with, and then the fourth parties that they are dependent on.
We've made it to the last poll question of the day, and this question is, does your organization assess fourth-party vendors either directly or by reviewing your vendor's third-party risk management program? Yes, all fourth parties are reviewed. No, we do not review any fourth parties. Some, but not all fourth parties are reviewed, or you're not sure. Kelly, we have another question here from the audience. What can we do if we find out one of our third-party vendors did not properly review or vet one of their vendors?
Well, of course, the first thing to do to even avoid that from happening is to, require of your third party a summary of their vendor management program. Again, back when you were first doing business with that third party, hopefully you're gathering due diligence documentations to vet them, and this is one area that should be vetted. But since you're asking this question, that makes me think that that hasn't been done. So, midterm, mid-contract, just certainly, especially if they are a critical vendor and they pose some risk to you, you should certainly go back and ask for them to provide that information to you. Provide, if they do have a formal third-party risk management program in place, what are they doing? How extensive is it? How are they evaluating the fourth parties that have access to your data? And depending, again, on the level of risk that they present to your company, you might even treat this as a formal issue that requires remediation from your vendor and put some tight follow-up procedures in place for ensuring that it gets completed. Again, remember, they're your vendor and you're paying them. Yes, you have a contractual relationship with them and they're going to, hold their feet to the fire as well. But, going into these relationships with your third parties as partners is so important to help remediate things like this when they happen mid-contract. But depending on the contract language with your third party, this lack of fourth party review might even constitute a default. It really depends on the language on the contract. But again, I recommend a partnership approach, going to your third party vendor and talking about why it's important for you to know how they're reviewing and monitoring the fourth parties that touch your data. Again, keep in mind, last thing, but keep in mind that the fourth party has no obligation to provide that to you. So you are really at the mercy of your third party to help you gather that.
And here are those results. Thank you again, everyone, for answering this question. Back in the related content widget, you can find our fourth party due diligence questions, what to ask your third party infographic. This resource helps you to understand what to ask your third party to get information to help you better understand your fourth party. Be sure to check it out. Kelly, I'll hand it back to you.
Over the next several slides, we're going to cover all of these items on this slide here, where we're talking about various techniques to risk manage your fourth and nth party. So let's just jump into each of these slides. Okay, let's first talk about disclosure and transparency. So you want to first know who your third-party vendors are. Or who your third-party vendors are working with, so who the fourth parties are of those third-party vendors. So first, you need to ask your third parties, these critical and high-risk third parties primarily, to provide you a complete list of the vendors that they are doing business with that have any access to your data or are essential, even if they don't have access to data, are essential or critical for their ability to continue to provide you services. You should do this on new vendors and existing vendors. This is something you may want to consider as part of your contractual obligation with your third party, that this is a requirement that they maintain this list and provide you updates, or even require your signature or your approval before making a change. And when it comes to these third parties, reviewing their SOC reports can be very helpful in determining who their critical subservice organizations are. And again, these are the ones that they are relying on in a significant way to perform those services to you. So that is one way to validate who they are. Then you want to actually build an inventory of the vendor relationship. So let's think about how you would do that. Find out who all of these fourth parties are. That include details about the product or services that they're providing to your third party, and then look for concentration risk. And by that, what I mean is how many fourth parties are providing services to more than one of your third-party vendors. This is very important because if you've got a high concentration in one fourth party that's impacting several of your vendors, and something happens with that fourth party that is critical and prevents them from providing services, then not only do you have one third-party vendor impacted, you have multiple third-party vendors impacted. So do your best to maintain this data in a way that is useful and reportable. So hopefully you have some type of solution that will allow you to do this. Of course, managing fourth-party risk really requires you to have more of an investigation into your third-party vendors' third-party risk management program. So you should have that, the third-party risk management, as a separate risk domain in your due diligence with your third parties. And by that, what I mean is you want to investigate your third-party risk management program, and you want to evaluate it. You want to ask questions around it. You want a list of their due diligence documents that they are gathering on their fourth parties to ensure that they are managing their vendors as to the same level that you are managing them. And again, you want to ensure that you have, especially again for your critical and high risk vendors, you want to have this as part of a contractual relationship with them, and that it is being reviewed on an ongoing basis, just as you are reviewing your third-party vendor on an ongoing basis. And I'm sure when you are requiring this of your third-party vendors, you will find some third-party vendors that do not have good third-party risk management practices themselves. So what should you do in those situations? Well, here's a list of several things. I'm going to call out just a few. First and foremost is you absolutely have to discuss it with your vendor. You need to even talk about a potential contractual requirement. And I found in this case, the contract would already be in place, but potentially you could look to amend the contract to require that they have good third-party risk management practices. You could consider asking them to carry more insurance so that you have a greater opportunity or leverage, I guess, against the third-party vendor if anything should happen. You may consider monitoring those fourth parties of the vendor that doesn't have a good third-party risk management program in place. And there's a few ways you can do that, but one of those ways is through some risk intelligence data. I think most important thing is to find out what your alternatives are, whether it is to continue doing business with this vendor or find another vendor and find ways to move on to a vendor who is performing acceptable third-party risk management practices. The most important thing is to have this conversation with your third-party vendor and know what they are doing with their fourth parties. After you have learned about your fourth parties, you've gotten that inventory, you've determined if you have a concentration risk, you know what type of third-party risk management practices your third party has, you may have found some fourth parties that you see as challenges, and there are ways to look at them. Again, I mentioned one is to actually perform some risk intelligence services on those fourth parties, and this is where these solutions out there are designed to gather and analyze information from various external sources. And the reason they're external sources, it gives you an insight from the outside in and not having gone into the fourth party, because again, you don't have a contractual relationship with them, so you likely don't have the various due diligence documents that you need to do that type of review. But this outside review, this risk intelligence review, can at least highlight some things that you might need to dig deeper in. So there are ways to take a look at these fourth parties if you believe that they do present a challenge to you. And let's talk again about concentration risk. I mentioned this briefly a moment ago, but this is where you have several third parties using the same fourth party. So here's some specific things you should be doing when you know this. One is to document the risk and the impact of that fourth party, because again, it could impact all of these third parties and not just one. Work with your enterprise risk department or your enterprise risk committee, whatever it is you might have, to include concentration risk in your organizational risk inventory, so your organization sees this as a significant thing to care about and to monitor. You may, again, want to consider alternatives. If you have a great concentration risk, you may want to consider another third party so that you will remove some of the risk around that concentrated fourth party. Monitor negative news around those fourth parties. That's fairly easy to do. And then monitor, again, the fourth party through that risk intelligence that I talked about just a few moments ago. And you will come across some fourth parties who refuse to cooperate, who refuse to allow your third party to share information with you. And here's a few things you can do in those instances. One is to ask your third party to consider a tri-party or multiple party NDA that might help the fourth party feel more comfortable in allowing the third party to share information with you. That's one thing. Another is to ask for redacted information. Maybe there's certain things that fourth party is not willing to share, but some things that they are willing to share. And then require your third party, that person, the company that you have a contract with, to provide a written attestation to the fourth party's risk management practices and controls to give you some more comfort and documentation that they understand what their fourth party risks are. And it's very likely that there will come a time when you become aware of an issue around one of the fourth party vendors. Some examples might be just some negative news or a regulatory enforcement possibly, or a data breach, maybe even a merger and acquisition. That's something that you would want to know about as well. So in these instances, when you are made aware of this, you certainly want to immediately contact your third party and ask them about the understanding of the situation, ask them possibly for a written mitigation plan on what their plan is with their contracted third party. Ask for continue to get formal follow-ups or follow specific timing on when you expect to hear back from them, because your relationship again is with your third party, so you're holding them accountable for getting this information to you. Certainly, if it's appropriate, you should inform your senior management or risk committee. Monitor news media for any updates on your own, and then again include this fourth party in your risk alerts, and monitor monitoring services if you have them related to the risk intelligence that I mentioned earlier. So if you recall back several slides ago to the picture of the fourth and nth parties, and again, that universe was very broad, and as I think I used the words unmanageable or hard to manage. So here are some strategies for managing those fourth party risks now and in the future. So one, educate your direct vendors on your expectations regarding third party risk management. So you're holding them accountable and you're expecting them to hold their fourth parties accountable and to know what their third-party risk management program is. Review your standard contract and make sure that your terms and conditions include third-party risk management practices, that they cover fourth parties and subcontractors, and ways to enforce your third party to ensure these third-party risk management practices are in place. Again, include third-party risk management as a separate risk domain in the due diligence with your third party. So by that we mean when you ask for updated financials or updated insurance or updated SOC reports or audit reports, you're also going to ask for updated third-party risk management policies. And then, again, that can be such a large list of fourth parties, so you want to focus on those critical and high-risk fourth parties, those fourth parties that would shut your business down if they shut down and have access to your critical and private information. Okay, so that brings us to our final slide in this part of the boot camp. And so let's cover some key takeaways. Again, just remember that a fourth party is a vendor that you do not have a direct relationship with, but you have a dependency on them. If there are fourth parties that could significantly impact your third party's ability to provide their services to you, then you need to pay some attention to them. And create an inventory of those fourth parties and look for that concentration risk that we talked about. Include third-party risk management as a separate risk domain in the due diligence with your third parties. That is a mouthful, but again, in the short of it, just make sure you're looking at your third party's risk management program documentation. And monitor the fourth parties using professional risk intelligence services. That's an easy way to look across many fourth parties simply. And then monitor significant fourth parties using some risks alert or monitoring services, internet-based negative news alerts, things like that. And with that, Jessie, I will turn it back over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Kelly. Before we dive into more questions and answers, I would like to thank everyone for attending our first day of the 3-day boot camp. I would also like to thank our experts from today, Hillary and Kelly, for their time in sharing some important information on vendor risk and vendor due diligence. Tomorrow, VinMinder's Information Security Operations Director, Lisa May Hill, will join us to discuss knowing your vendor's cybersecurity posture to protect your organization, vendor business continuity and disaster recovery as part of your cybersecurity program, and assessing vendor SOC reports, reviewing findings, and next steps. After Lisa, Hillary Dewhurst, VinMinder's Head of Third-Party Risk Education and Advocacy, will join us to discuss managing AI risk with third-party risk management. Let's now go ahead and answer some more questions that have come in during this session. Okay, Hillary, this next question will come to you. And this question is, when assessing criticality of a vendor's service or product, do we evaluate inherent criticality or residual criticality? And if we know that we can fall back on an older process fairly easily, is it still a critical service?
Okay, so two things here. First of all, something is either critical or not critical. There's not a lot of in between. And as you described, if you know that you have a fallback, you might not be as affected if that vendor is offline for more than 24 hours, or you'd have a way to reduce that impact to your customers. So based on your own organization's definition of critical, it may not be critical, but it's really important to understand that there is no such thing as residual criticality. Something is either critical or it is not critical. That does not change based on the controls. I hope that helps.
Great. Kelly, we'll come over to you for this next question. Is there regulatory guidance that requires us to monitor and conduct due diligence on fourth-party vendors?
Sorry, Jesse, I think I spoke over you. So essentially, there's not guidance that states you are required to do due diligence per se. The guidance, especially as it relates to financial institutions, which I'm the most familiar with and is the most comprehensive, I think, in the way of guidance, it certainly states that financial institutions are to know about relevant fourth parties and ensure that they're being managed and monitored appropriately. The guidance doesn't specifically outline what has to happen as it relates to fourth parties, not like it does outline specifics that need to take place with third parties. I think it's just becoming more and more important as and more in the forefront as the cyber attacks continue, as business resilience becomes ever more of a concern. That's where more focus and attention is now being placed on these fourth parties. And while the regulations may not state specific things that need to be done with them, the more you can get that in line with what you are doing with the third parties, the better off your organization is going to be. It won't be in parity, of course, but there should certainly be a strive to include specific ongoing monitoring activities in some form or fashion with your fourth parties. So I hope that provided a response.
Great, thanks, Kelly. Hillary, we will come back to you for this next question.
Okay.
Why should we not have criticality to be 3 levels and not just 2?
Okay, so this kind of dovetails into the earlier question, which is something is either critical or not critical. And I'm not sure from the question if they're considering those 2 levels, but when we're talking about criticality, we are trying to identify those vendor relationships or products and services that are operationally essential for our business or that can affect our customers, right? There isn't a lot of gray in that. So it's either critical based on your criteria or it's not critical. There's not layers of criticality. I hope that helps.
Great, thank you. Kelly, we come back to you for this next question. What are my options if I can't obtain any information on my fourth parties?
Yeah, and that's definitely going to happen. So a few options, and I did talk briefly about this. One is to use some form of risk intelligence data to do an outside look in. VenMinder has our own form of that we call VenMonitor. There's others out there as well. But again, what this allows you to do is to gain an outside-in view versus an inside view, because again, you don't have that contractual relationship with those fourth parties, so you're probably not going to get enough information to do an inside view. But that's one thing you can do. Another option might be to negotiate a modification with your third-party contract to require some level of due diligence and monitoring with the critical fourth parties that is made available to you. That may be something you push for in extreme, situations with your third-party vendors. Maybe that's something you would use if you learned of a concentration risk across multiple third-party vendors. This is an area that you would want to push on. And again, what If you have a good relationship and a partnership with your vendor, a modification might be something that is that you could obtain. Another one is asking to meet possibly with the third party and the fourth party so that you could maybe interview them and, you know, make some notes to document that discussion. A last resort, if you had no other option, is to change vendors. Just finding a third-party vendor offering the same service that will commit to some strong third-party risk management program that allows you access to the information on those fourth parties. So there's a few options there.
Great, thanks, Kelly. Hillary, we come over to you for the next question. How do you ensure your due diligence process and data collection is fit for purpose and doesn't annoy your vendor owner and vendor while still ensuring you have the appropriate level of information to make a determination?
So that's actually a great question, because when we're doing due diligence, we don't want to ask the vendor about a bunch of information that is not relevant to the risks in the product and services that they offer. So that is where your inherent risk assessment is going to be very useful. That tool is going to help you identify exactly what types of risks are present, like do I have operational risk or cybersecurity or reputational or compliance risk associated with this product and service. And where you do have those risks, you have to validate that the vendor has the controls in place to mitigate those risks. So making sure that you have a good process up front, that inherent risk assessment to identify the risk and quantify the amount of risk, and not asking your vendors to provide a bunch of information that's not relevant. So, again, your vendor owners and your vendors should understand that the only information that you're requesting of them, the information that you're seeking to validate, is essential because those risks were identified in the product or service. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Hillary. And I think we have time for one more really quick question. Back to you. Can one SME review due diligence for all domains?
Okay. So the thing about subject matter experts is they should be qualified. That means that they have some sort of professional certification and credentials associated to that risk domain. So, for example, a CPA might review financials, or a certified cybersecurity expert. Now, I personally have a lot of knowledge about multiple risk domains because I've been doing this a long time. That doesn't necessarily mean I'm qualified to provide an opinion on the sufficiency of controls. So what I really want to emphasize here is that if you're having one person look at everything and they're not really qualified to provide that opinion, and you have an audit or a regulatory exam and they come in and they ask, like, who made this decision, you might have some uncomfortable answering to do. So while it might be possible that everyone is, somebody is qualified and credentialed in all those areas, it's not too likely. So I would try and avoid that situation wherever possible. And just keep in mind that if you don't have that expertise internally, there's plenty of third-party risk services companies, VendMinder's one, there's many out there that do provide those vendor control reviews, and you can use them. The regulators say it's perfectly fine. Just make sure that you're not putting that whole burden on the same person, especially if they're not qualified. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks so much, Hillary. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have left for questions today. Thank you, Hillary and Kelly, for taking the time to address some of those that came in. Any questions we did not have time to answer today, we will address offline. We would like to thank you all for attending, and I hope you found today's session valuable. You can ask even more questions inside of our third-party think tank, an online community that is dedicated to third-party risk professionals and free to join. Just because today's session has ended doesn't mean the conversations and questions must. Post your questions at thirdpartythinktank.com and see what your peers have to say. In the community, you'll find thousands of free educational resources related to third-party risk management topics, such as ones discussed today. Criticality, risk ratings, vendor contracts, and fourth and nth parties are all there to assist you. If you'd like to become a member of Third Party Think Tank, you can register on the site or shoot us an email and we'll get you registered and send you a link to set your password. We did record today's session, and that recording link will be provided to you in an email on Friday afternoon. Also in the email will be the survey link for you to request the CPE credits. We would like to thank you all for attending and hope you found day 1 of the bootcamp valuable. I'd also like to give another big shout out to Hillary and Kelly for their time and content. On behalf of VidMinder, it has been a pleasure. Thank you, and we will see you tomorrow for the second day of the bootcamp.